So on behalf of the Wildlife Department, we'd like to welcome you to the Next Generation Wildlife Ecoseries. This series highlights the achievements and amplifies the voices of early career wildlife biologists. This next generation of scientists is more diverse than the community of natural resource scientists as a whole. However, we recognize that systemic racism continues to impose barriers for BIPOC, that is Black, Indigenous, and people of color, who are seeking careers in natural resources. So this speaker series not only spotlights the professional achievements of BIPOC scientists who are role models for this next generation, it would also serve as a forum to discuss how our field can move forward to reduce these barriers and become a more inclusive community. The Wildlife Department is committed to challenging the status quo in the discipline and to propelling a more diverse next generation of wildlife biologists. So I'll now turn it over to Matt Johnson, who will introduce today's speaker for us.
All right, thanks, Frank. Hi, everybody. Boy, it's my privilege to introduce Marshall Johnson today. Marshall does some really exciting work. He serves as the Vice President of Audubon Dakota, where for the past decade, he's worked to build rural and urban community-focused habitat and ecosystem programs. He's equipped with a business degree from the University of Minnesota. He strives to bring conservation into the 21st century, creating eco-friendly profit centers and urban habitat initiatives driven by the ecosystem services they provide to human communities. So his pioneering work in the Dakotas brings farmers, ranchers, retailers, and consumers together with Grasslands into this herds and birds idea, a win-win alignment. So it's groundbreaking market-based conservation ranching program now enrolls more than 2.3 million acres across 96 ranches, additionally creating safe passage and respite for wildlife and wild humans within an urban context has been a priority for Audubon Dakota while under Marshall's leadership, with the program now managing the largest urban conservation program in the Northern Great Plains. So I'll close with this quote from Marshall. He says, "If we don't fundamentally change what we're doing, our grandkids will talk about grasslands, butterflies, and birds the way we now talk about department stores and dinosaurs." So with that, welcome, Marshall.
Thank you, Matt. Can you hear me okay? Good deal. You know, it's always funny to hear a quote read back to you, and you kind of wonder, what was I thinking that day? What kind of mood was I in when I said that? It's really a pleasure to be with you all today, and sorry that I can't be there in person. I love your campus there at Humboldt State. I was about that close to playing football and attending Humboldt State. And I'll talk a little bit about my background here in a moment, but it's a wonderful campus up that way, and just a beautiful, there's so many beautiful parts of California that I lived there half my life growing up, and there's still places I haven't seen yet, and we traveled quite a bit. But again, happy to be here, share some thoughts, ideas, perspective about my background and the work that we're doing. I think it's important sometimes to start with a question that I kind of ask myself when I think about my role as a conservation leader. I am also a very proud Black man who lives and works in North Dakota. So it begs the question, how did I get here? I think about it quite a bit. I grew up in Los Angeles and Dallas, Texas. Conservation, natural resource, wildlife, it couldn't have been the farthest thing from my mind growing up. There weren't a plethora of opportunities to get involved, to be knowledgeable of, or certainly not consider a career in natural resource conservation in wildlife. I didn't necessarily, those opportunities and those role models weren't evident there. So I always had a plan to go to business school, attend law school, and go into law. That was my plan after, of course, playing 15 years in the NFL, right? I was going to, that was my plan when I was, 15, 16 years old. And it was a serendipitous way that I came to this work. I spent a lot of time in West Texas. I had a uncle who lived out in West Texas, and we commuted. It sounds kind of ridiculous to use the word commute between California and Texas, but we moved between Texas and California quite a bit. And not something that I was overly conscious about when I was a kid, but it home to me where I felt real comfortable was out in the middle of nowhere. Grasslands, prairie, those pastures out in West Texas, in eastern New Mexico. That just always appealed to me, but in sort of a untouchable way, something that was abstract. I would never really have anything to do with it, and that was that. And so it was actually not until I played football at the University of Minnesota, studied business. So up until about 19 or 20 years old, I was on that track that I always kind of thought that I would be on. And it was in a prairie chicken blind that I had gotten to in kind of a serendipitous way route that it just brought me back to being a kid in the back of the car with my Goosebump books and Walkmans and tuning out and just looking out at the prairie. And there was something about being in that prairie chicken blind at 6 in the morning and watching the dance of the chickens. And if you haven't experienced prairie chicken, the annual spring mating ritual where they find these leks, and these populations have been coming back to these leks for hundreds and even thousands of years. These leks have been active, and it's really a special kind of, you just never forget it. And I never forgot it that day. And that then and there, I sort of made a shift that I wanted to explore prairie conservation, anathema to my parents and to everyone that wanted me to succeed. What are you talking about? But for me, I'm the youngest of 9 boys and girls, and I've always sort of marched to the beat of my own drum. And I decided that I would move to Fargo, North Dakota, and take a part-time job with Audubon Dakota. And part of me said I'd be there, 3 or 4 months, and I'd get back on with my life. And that was 13 years ago now. So I've never really grown up. I've had one job. I've had one adult job. It's been working for the National Audubon Society out of our Fargo office. Roundabout way, a year and a half later, I became the vice president, executive director. I was all of about 23 years old, and I kind of use that loosely. I didn't have any staff or any projects or any prospects really, but I did have a title, and I did have sort of and as I talk about one of our projects in depth here, there is no doubt in my mind that my upbringing, which was very different than your typical Great Plains natural resources professional. A lot of my colleagues are 1 or 2 generations removed from the family farm. They're hunters, they're sportsmen and women, and are have their family has had an interest in natural resources conservation. There's no doubt in my mind that my perspective growing up in urban Los Angeles, urban Dallas, Texas, it definitely has enhanced my ability to be effective in prairie conservation. I know that sounds weird, And I'll touch on it for two main reasons. And that's a part of what I've focused on as a conservation professional has been choice, empowering people everyday people, to make a difference with routine, everyday activities that they would normally do. And I'm going to focus on our market-based conservation program because this is an idea concept. When me and my colleagues, when we began conceptualizing this, it was kind of fodder for a joke, right? What are you talking about? You're going to put the National Audubon Society's name on packages of beef? Good luck with that, right? That's kind of ridiculous, right? And there's a method and track to the madness, but also in the urban conservation work, we have a growing new American population, and it may sound odd to to folks that maybe haven't spent a lot of time in the Northern Great Plains. Our cities are becoming more and more diverse. They're growing at a rapid pace, and so my experiences as someone growing up on the blacktop and growing up in very developed, even overdeveloped environments, empowering people and local community leaders to incorporate natural infrastructure as a part of urban development. I don't know that I would have had that perspective had I not come from cities that didn't have those opportunities. So I'm going to only touch on that project or program a little bit, but all of it is wrapped into I think what has been my unique perspective and what I brought to the natural resources conservation world here. And what I know that the overall diversifying of the people and the communities that they come from that are working on natural resources and conservation issues will bring to the table. I think changing and enriching the perspective of the people doing this work on behalf of Earth, wildlife, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's vital. It's vital to the relevancy of this work. But shifting back again to kind of the market-based and conservation and where that all came out of, I stepped into grassland prairie conservation at the worst time, right? Between, when you think about it, we traditionally envision Earth Day as being kind of the high watermark of conservation, of environmentalism, of environmental awareness and activism. Since 1970, we've lost nearly 3 billion birds. Right, since 1970, and the majority of those birds have been grassland birds. We've had a relative environmental catastrophe play out since that high water mark, and I think it goes to show I think we haven't quite arrived, and I would venture to say that one of the reasons, one of the untapped resources and power in environmentalism and conservation are people. That may sound weird, but conservation typically rests outside of our everyday lives, and particularly grassland conservation, and that's obviously near and dear to me. Grasslands were once one of our most ubiquitous native ecosystems here in the lower 48, here in North America. And we've lost a tremendous amount of this ecosystem. Annual year-over-year loss of grasslands is comparable to what we lose in the Amazon rainforest. We lose in a typical year millions of acres grassland. So that trend of grassland birds, it's to be expected. When you look at and you think about other suites of birds that we've lost, that make up that nearly 3 billion that we've lost, the majority, overwhelming majority, are tied to grasslands. Yes, grassland birds, but when you pull out a list of shorebirds that nest in the lower 48, many of them nest actually in alkali wetlands that are surrounded by grassland. So their nesting habitat, the marbled godwit, upland sandpiper, these shorebirds, which are declined by 37% since 1970, also rely on grasslands. So grasslands, I've become a bit of a grasslands evangelist, I guess you could say, because it's such a silent suffering. Birds are sort of our, I think of them as the songstresses and troubadours of the sky. They're our playlist for our time in nature. And birds that have called out and been that playlist for us in nature on this continent are calling out with their silence now. And it's sort of a silent catastrophe that is happening, because most people are only somewhat aware of the plight of grasslands in North America. You can take a look at this snapshot of the central grassland ecosystem and the various ecoregions. And we typically say that 50% are between 50 and 60% of grasslands have been lost over the last 100 years, 150 years. But really, when you dive into some of the ecotypes or ecoregions, that number is, for let's say the eastern tallgrass prairie, it's more than 99%. There's less than 1% of native tallgrass prairie remaining out on the landscape. So the bulk of what is left is what could not heretofore be plowed up or converted or developed for a myriad of reasons. And so, and there are a number of maps that I could show you that, yes, it's a grassland problem, it's a grassland bird problem, but our rivers, streams, and tributaries depend on this ecosystem for filtration, for taking water, rainwater and snow melt, and recharging clean water aquifers, pollinators, bees, butterflies. There's a reason North Dakota and South Dakota are the #1 and #2 honeybee producing states in the country. It's because the amount of grasslands we still have left, and the amount of wildflowers that are part of the grassland ecosystem. And what we're losing is really tied to our food system. It's inextricably linked to food, and our conservation efforts that we typically carry out in the Northern Great Plains or in this ecosystem. You don't know about them, right? They rest outside of the mainstream. We do easements, and I've been our team have been leaders in grassland easements with landowners and cost share programs and acquisitions and so on and so forth. And it's really just a drop in the bucket. We've only protected in 150 years roughly 6% of this ecosystem. Only 6% of what remains is actually protected. And so this is where we started to examine and reach for sort of the third rail of conservation, tying grassland enhancement, grassland management directly to the food system. It may sound weird, but we actually don't do that. We don't have a lot of market-based conservation programs for the various ecosystems. And so this was a way for us to explore that concept by building a set of protocols that speak to what birds, pollinators, the ecosystem needs to thrive, and examining if we could use cattle to achieve those goals, and try to steer people towards the Audubon Green Seal and the certification in a way that helped incentivize those practices that enhance wildlife habitat, promote biodiversity, enhance the ability of grassland soils to sequester carbon out of the atmosphere. When grasslands are lost, up to 50% of the carbon that's stored and has been stored in those grasslands for maybe thousands of years is emitted into the atmosphere. So grasslands, when we're converting, destroying them, become actually huge emitters of carbon dioxide. Between I believe 2008 and 2012, the amount of grasslands that were converted emitted roughly 3.6 billion metric tons of carbon. That's the equivalent of 670 million cars. You think about that, right? If we're not protecting grasslands, sometimes I'm going to say something. It's one of those things. You know, years later, someone will quote me, and I'll think, "What was I thinking when I said this?" But climate change is the biggest threat to our environment. There's no doubt about that. But one thing that I think that we don't always do well as humans is we don't have always the ability to have a nuanced engagement, a nuanced discussion where we can focus on climate change and biodiversity, right? The lower 48's biodiversity is inextricably linked, just given the land mass of the historic grassland ecosystem. It's inextricably linked to how we do in protecting the last 50% or so of the grassland ecosystem. And sometimes, you know, we really are obsessively, for good reason, obsessively focused on climate change, separate and apart from biodiversity. I think we have to identify and promote solutions that start with biodiversity as a means to addressing climate change. They have to be together. They're not always. And things like the grassland ecosystem crisis can get lost in the mix, and it's really a part of the overall issue. So, tangent over. We really saw the need for conservation strategies that reached the everyday soccer mom, hockey dad, people who eat, right? Because our food, the need for more corn and beans and other row crop intensive agriculture, that's what's driving the loss of grasslands. Kind of simple, right? That is the main driver of grassland loss over the last 150 years. And as we develop new varieties of corn and beans to grow in areas that they couldn't 20 years ago, we break up more prairie. We lose more grassland bird habitat and all of the other things that we've talked about. So incentivizing those practices in a scalable way were really what we were after. And again, when you look at grasslands and you look at where the greatest potential for soil carbon sequestration exists, it's under that historic grassland ecosystem, and that's obviously a focus. And again, why this is linked to our need for addressing climate change as well. And so in thinking about this, we wanted to create a value chain that kind of addressed the various needs of the stakeholders, right? The rancher has to be incentivized, supported, receive technical assistance to do this type of management, which costs more money and some, at least costs more time, not necessarily more money, but more time in going from conventional grazing, which isn't great for biodiversity and the health of grasslands, to more rotational grazing, holistic grazing, adaptive management, which we require and promote through enrollment in this program. We want to manage for pollinators, soil health, and of course for grassland birds. And then this is also forcing Audubon to do something that most environmental conservation groups aren't traditionally good at, and that is marketing products, marketing to our members, raising awareness about the power that all of us as individuals have in enacting change. Now, and I want to address something because it comes up from time to time. Well, Marshall, with big issues like this, individual consumers should not bear the brunt and the burden of change. And this should be done at a global and national political policy level. I agree. And take one look at our political environment today and tell me if you trust your environment to that. The answer I always come up with is, and I'll never stop using my voice as a voter to support candidates and policies that enhance and promote biodiversity in grassland conservation and addressing climate change. But we do have to realize that there is a bit of stagnation and dysfunction in our political system, and we have to use all of our tools and all of our abilities to drive change. And being able to, we all eat, and being able to use your choice of food to directly drive improvement, I think that's a very powerful thing. There are a few thousand of us that work in grassland conservation. We work with a few hundred, even thousands of philanthropists and donors, but there's 300 million people in America, right? So when you compare, we focus, our program is a grass-fed, pasture-raised program. That aligns most closely with Audubon's values. So animals are never confined, fed, never ever antibiotics or growth hormones, et cetera, et cetera. But when you look at just the grass-fed beef market and the amount of energy, capital that flows through that marketplace, and you compare it with all of the energy, capital, money, people that are working in grassland conservation, it dwarfs the environmental conservation movement. So markets hold an incredible amount of power if we can attach or embed them with conservation values. I think it really is a tremendously untapped resource and opportunity, and that's what we've been pursuing, promoting through the Conservation Ranching Initiative. It's now America's largest regenerative program in the country. It's now 3.5 million acres under management. It exists in about 18 different states now, 150 family ranches participating. And I think the points of purchases are now closer to 1,000, or will be by the end of the year. And it's available online through a number of our market partners. And again, those bird-friendly production standards, we've broken those down into 4 categories: forage and feeding, animal welfare, environmental stewardship, and then habitat management. So to enroll in the program, our ranchers have to make changes. They are, and we deliver cost share programs, different things to help them do that, in the hope that the consumer through premiums will incentivize that and drive that change. So far, that has happened, but we still have a long ways to go in terms of seeking and seeing the type of impact that we envision and want to see. I think a catch-all term for what we're promoting is regenerative grazing. I don't always love that name because I don't know what, there's 1,000 different definitions for regenerative ag. We have our own, but for lack of a better term, we're through the program, through enrollment, we promote and assist with the transition and adoption of what you would consider regenerative grazing practices. I kind of call it regenerative grass-fed or regenerative bird-friendly grazing. You can be regenerative and not be beneficial to local ecosystems. You can be organic and be the worst ranch for birds, biodiversity, and soil carbon sequestration. So finding that area where, like a Venn diagram, bird habitat, practicality, soil carbon sequestration, where all of those things fit, that's been the struggle, but that's been the reward in building this program sort of from the ground up. And what are we seeing, right? Just this winter, we successfully published, our science team, a approach that we call the Bird Friendliness Index. This allows us to monitor. We do monitoring on every ranch that's enrolled. We do bird monitoring. We're doing now soil carbon monitoring as well, and other ecological monitoring that lets us track the success of our production standards. And on average, our enrolled ranches have increased their bird abundance by, on average, 36%. So again, even if we're not able to enroll the 300 million acres of remaining grasslands, that's not the goal. If we're able to enroll 10 or 15 million acres and drastically increase the amount of birds on those ranches, it really gives us a fighting chance in preserving the amount of grassland birds and working to arrest the decline of grassland birds. But also it empowers consumers with information and the ability to make change in a way that historically they may not have felt the opportunity in having. So we're really trying to both raise awareness about the issue and empower people and actually make a difference for birds on the ground. As we move forward, scaling up the program, I'm happy to say by the beginning of next year, with the partnerships at hand, we will certify more than 30% of the entire domestic grass-fed beef market. And that really gives us this opportunity to scale the impact, tell the story in a way that I liken what I think we're going for. I can't see all your hands, but if you eat tuna, for instance, if you go home and you look at your tuna can, you will see a dolphin. There's a 99.9% chance you will see a dolphin emblem. And that Earth Island Institute created the dolphin safe production standards for tuna. And that program was created in 1990, directly relating to that, and other things as well. But that certification is credited with reducing dolphin deaths attributed to tuna fishing by nearly 99%. When the program was launched in 1990, on average, I believe about 700,000 dolphins were dying every year directly as a result of tuna fishing. And now more than 90%, 95% of tuna brands carry and adhere to those production standards. So certifications get a bad rap. I share in some of the even as a manager of one of the nation's now largest certifications, I share in some of the skepticism around certifications. But I think this is really presenting itself as a opportunity to scale conservation in a way that we haven't had the tools to do in the last 30 or 40 years. And while this is a premium approach to conservation now, I think over time and very quickly, we have to lower the costs in a way that makes this available to the masses. And one of the ways that I envision that happening is adoption through things like the United States dietary guidelines. The dietary guidelines, which are completed every 4 or 5 years, have enormous purchasing power. The United States government has enormous purchasing power through those guidelines. And I think that's another way to scale regenerative bird-friendly agriculture. I want to have enough time for us to take any questions, but so I'm not going to touch on the urban work today, but I would just finish by saying, again, when I think about my work and I think about the ways in which we have started from the ground up new approaches to conservation, there's no doubt that my background and different perspective drove a lot of that work and opened up avenues for our teams that maybe we otherwise wouldn't have had. And I think it speaks to what I think is one of the biggest untapped resources, and that's diversity and inclusion and equity within the conservation movement. If it doesn't happen, the National Audubon Society, you fill in the blank nonprofit, and the work itself has a real chance of becoming irrelevant because the work and the people doing the work really don't come from the communities that make up America. And so, again, I would leave you with that food for thought when you think about this program or so many of the innovative ideas and concepts that are coming from people that, again, we don't normally see represented in this field. So with that, I thank you for listening to me ramble on for the last 40 minutes. And I would encourage any questions, criticisms, or anything you'd like to throw at me.
All right, thank you so much, Marshall. I think there's a couple of questions in the chat. Looks like maybe Barbara has also raised her hand. Barbara and Chris. I think Barbara had your hand up first. You want to go start, Barbara?
Yeah, thank you so much for that great talk. I have a question about getting the ranchers and farmers on board with the program, and then thinking about how social norms might help out ecologically, because I'm thinking that if you have more farms that are closer together and that could create some connectedness across these bird-friendly farms. And so did you find that, like, if you got one farmer or rancher on board, that his or her neighbors were more likely to join in, or what did that process look like?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Yes, when you start to drill down into our pockets, the map there of the ranches, you will definitely, I can definitely think of examples that played out much like that, where there was one leader within a township or a county that didn't slam the door in Marshall's face, and that their adoption led to building trust and um, uh, uh, widespread adoption in that area. Widespread is the wrong word, but a lot more people that were interested in the program. I will say this, I think it was just the timing. The ranching community can be, they're very independent. They can be resistant to change. I think that's true within rural communities, maybe all communities, but I certainly know that that's something that's a badge of honor or pride in rural communities, for better or for worse, and they'd be the first to tell you for better or for worse. When we started this program, we thought that the audience that you're referring to would be our toughest sale. By far, the ranching community, even ranchers that are not and do not plan to enroll in our program, have been so supportive of, because we weren't just the environmental group that was pointing fingers. We wanted to roll up our sleeves, put our name in the game, risk our brand, quite frankly, if the science matched up and they were willing to adopt the practices. And so I don't want to belittle anyone in any way, but I was surprised by that a little bit, because we're not a mainstream grassland conservation organization. We're the Audubon Society, and we are an environmental organization, and they were very receptive. The ranching partners have been very receptive to it, even if it has meant some change for them. So
it's great to hear. Thank you.
Daniel. Sorry, Matt, I'm taking over.
No, quite all right.
Marshall, thank you very much for joining us and for your talk and for all of your work on grassland bird conservation. I really appreciate all of it. And I have a question, having worked for one of those naive and maybe more difficult conservation groups that didn't have very good relationships with ranchers at times. I have a question that often came up in some of those discussions, and I'm sure it's something you thought about it. I'm sure you have a great view on it. So, one of the criticisms of cattle-based agriculture is that from a climate standpoint, they often reduce the ability of grasslands, very condition dependent, very regional dependent, but they often reduce the ability of grasslands to sequester carbon. They also emit a substantial amount of methane, which depends on their diet, depends on quite a few other factors like what gut microbia they have, et cetera, right? But they do emit a substantial amount of methane. And then in some regions, it's demonstrable that cattle grazing has a negative effect on biodiversity of birds, including some of the sites that it looks like some of the ranches in your program are enrolled in, right? In the Intermountain West and the Great Basin, where it's pretty easy to show like cattle grazing is not good for birds. So I guess how do you rectify those three things pulling you in different directions, right? Like carbon, cows make carbon, cows can reduce carbon sequestration, and they can actually be bad for birds, but you're trying to put everybody in this big tent of working together to promote grassland conservation. And thanks.
Absolutely, it's a great question, and so let me take it in pieces here. Number one, I'd say cattle don't have a natural place everywhere. I think that's just true. I think that there are a lot of places where bison and elk and other historic ruminants would never have spent a tremendous amount of time. And we have tended to, we've said no to a lot of brand partners that had a network that were, just focused in on clear-cut forests that are now pasture land. And we've tried to steer away from that and focus. You see the bulk of our ranches, overwhelming bulk of our ranches are in the northern Great Plains, the central grasslands, et cetera, et cetera. I think in some of those areas that are more of a gray area, I think there's a ability to have that balance, and it requires on the part of the ranch sacrifices, in herd size and stocking rates and rotation, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's absolutely true that some places are just naturally, they would be hard pressed to support large ruminants because they never did. And there are some exceptions that we make on a localized kind of basis, and we work through that. One instance that comes to mind, a ranch in Northern California, they have a winter grazing area that is probably in a place that I naturally would not love them to be, quite frankly. And their summer grazing is more in the shrubland and areas where sensitive grazing can take place and take place effectively. And so we're looking for options for them to find a pasture outside of that forested area. So I think you're right that just cattle are not going to be environmentally friendly everywhere. When I think about what's happening in the Amazon rainforest, where huge swaths of the rainforest are being cleared for pasture, it's highly problematic. So that's one thing. The second, I think the data science is still emerging on one of the questions when I think about anthropogenic climate change. And I look at, I believe the last EPA report said that animal-based agriculture was about 2.6 percent of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. When I think about anthropogenic climate change, anthropogenic meaning human cause, I have personally, when I game out the scenario, I have a hard time believing that our animal-based methane levels are, and a number of research projects have illuminated, our animal-based methane levels are not exceedingly higher than they were 5,000 years ago or 500 years ago. We don't have the 15 or 20, 25 million elk, the 50 million, there's differences, 30 million, 60 million bison that would have inhabited these areas. And so, and all of them being large ruminant animals that probably don't animal to animal produce as much methane as domesticated cattle, but you get my point. All of those wild animals together you look at methane levels from animals, they're not exceedingly different than they were pre-industrial revolution. And so all things considered, tomorrow, if we were to wipe all of the cattle in America off the landscape, what we have to do is kind of game out what happens next, right? Unless you're going to curtail whole stock and barrel property rights, right? It's fairly obvious that a lot of that land would be converted to other use, and the biodiversity would be lost along with it. When I think about animal, and I keep saying animal-based agriculture, but I really mean cattle. I think when you look at biodiversity that would be lost without cattle, and you look at the ability to manage cattle in a way that mimics the grazing patterns of historic wild animals, and I think there is that ability through rotational grazing and rest use rotations. All things considered, I think cattle are not incompatible with a climate safe future. I'm convinced of that. Again, when you also factor in the amount of biodiversity that would be lost. So that's how I reconcile it and how we reconcile it all together. Great question, complicated answer. Thank you, Dan. Phoebe.
All right. Yeah, Phoebe.
My question was pretty touched on. This is good. I no longer have.
Okay.
Okay, great. Yeah, there's a couple from the chat that maybe I'll draw your attention to. So one question early on was about the rise of lab-grown meat, and do you see that being an ally for bird-friendly beef or for bird conservation overall?
Yeah, I think I'm just going to focus on, and it is the question lab grown or plant grown, or just lab grown?
Well, maybe Samantha could chime in, but in the chat it says lab grown.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say lab grown or just other meat alternatives. I think I was just thinking of lab grown because it is kind of starting to grow and become more popular.
Yeah, absolutely. I haven't seen lab grown meat. The projections are modeling that shows the scalability and the associated impacts or repercussions from it. I know I'm more familiar with plant-based meat alternatives just because it has scaled so dramatically here in the last 3 or 4 years. When I think about, it's kind of a zero-sum equation for me. When you look at what goes into particularly plant-based meats, you plant those plants, and there's soy, corn, things that are driving habitat loss in the grassland ecosystem. Obviously, raising demand for those things will raise the need for more land and more native prairie being broken out. When I think about bird-friendly beef or arresting the decline of grasslands and grassland birds, I certainly have not seen a compelling scenario where plant-based meat is actually a good thing in that context.
Thank you.
Okay, another question from the chat. What can others do to support advocates for grasslands who do not live in those states?
Not everyone buys or eats beef, and I certainly never encourage anyone that doesn't eat beef to eat beef. It's a personal choice. But if you do, I think one way to feel better about and feel good about your purchasing and diet in that regard is to verify the production methodology of your beef or any food, right? There's so many options today to select food that is grown in a more environmentally progressive and friendly way. I think exercising that power is important. I'm a millennial, so when I hear myself say that, I kind of cringe a little bit because we're a poor generation, and we certainly, it seems like every major in economic catastrophe we've been smack dab in the middle of. So I think over time, it is incumbent upon people like me and programs like Audubon's program to drive down the costs and widen the availability of eco-friendly products like those grown with the Audubon seal. But I think that is what we can all do. There's a lot of things, right? Recycle, make sure your vote counts. There are a lot of things that everyone talks about, and they're absolutely important. But I often think about what am I eating, and what better choices could I make to support the environment through my diet. I think that is one thing that is a opportunity for everyone. And if it's not financially an opportunity, we have to change that as well as a part of the broader situation. So.
Great. Frank, you had a question?
Yeah, Dan asked part of it, but I'm just curious, kind of building on that. These grasslands are such diverse systems, even just here in North America, between desert grasslands, tall grass, short grass. Has it been a challenge to develop guidelines that work for a whole program and also are regional specific there? What kind of granularity is there in terms of the guidelines?
Yeah, that's a great question. So each ecoregion has its own protocols. There are certain, we probably wouldn't, for instance, I also run our Dakotas program, and we have a 500, I believe a 500 acre native perennial grassland requirement. And I've taken a lot of flack about that, quite frankly. Even if it's a small area and it's doing good things, shouldn't it qualify? With the amount of drift and chemical drift that you will find in intensively row crop agriculture landscapes, you are running the potential of creating grassland bird sinks. The structural heterogeneity that will attract birds in the springtime, but then a collapse in the insect populations and food web to support the reproduction of birds because of neonicotinoid pesticides and other chemicals that damage that food supply. So we have that limit. And so that may not be, that's not the same in Missouri, because a 500 acre grassland ranch in Missouri is a huge ranch. There's just so little left of grassland bird habitat in Missouri that we don't have that same restriction because it's down to the wire. And so each ecoregion has its own set of protocols targeting its own set of localized fauna and flora. And your other part of your question, has it been a challenge? Yes, yes. A lot of our ranches, this program doesn't work if we just select ranches that are doing great things. That sounds a little bit counterintuitive, right? But we didn't start this to provide us a sort of clearinghouse for, attaboy, attagirl, you're doing great things. It was a pathway for continuous improvement, eventually, of ranches that, are not incorporating rotational grazing, are doing continuous long grazing, which with cattle, because they graze so differently from bison and elk and other natural wild grazing animals, continuous grazing, which has been the bedrock of conventional ranching for 100 years, it really does a number on an ecosystem, a local grassland ecosystem, because Cattle, and this is where I think in the environmental community, cattle really get a bad rap, and deservedly so. They graze different. They love a plant for its nutritional value. They will hover over that plant until it comes back, and they'll eat it, and then it's gone. So the rest and the rotation of cattle is really important. And what you're doing is you're mimicking those bison and elk and other wild grazing animals. Those concepts for certain producers are newer concepts, require additional infrastructure, a change in some cases their whole management scheme. And so we've had those tough conversations. We've always tried to come back to the science. And one of the designs of the program, which is very different from most certifications, we've been deliberate about there is no cost to ranchers to enroll in our program. We do not cost share with our market partners to carry the certification. Our program is funded 100% through our traditional philanthropic means, because if someone is not adhering to the protocols and grazing in a regenerative, bird-friendly manner that's been laid out, we don't want finances and other entanglements to factor into the decision to maybe ask a ranch to leave or discontinue a ranch's certification. So building those protocols that can have wide adoption, buy-in, that's always a challenge, Frank, and it's been a challenge, but we've made it work. Is it perfect? No, but as we've been monitoring the floral and fauna on these ranches, we're seeing definitive improvements across our network of ranches. So that means that we're at least pointed in the right direction, even if we're not moving as fast as we'd like to.
Great, thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks so much. Well, I'm mindful of the time. We're past 5 o'clock here, at least in California. So thank you so much, Marshall. I think there are a few more questions in the chat, so if you'd be willing to share your contact, there's probably a couple people that would love to follow up with a question or two if you're available for that. But we're towards the end of our time here, and we really have enjoyed you visiting, and we've learned a lot. So I want to thank you on behalf of the whole Wildlife Department.
Absolutely, and I will stay on as long as anyone has questions. I love.
Well, that's generous. Thank you very much. Okay, so yeah, feel free, folks, if you need to move on. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Ecoseries. But there were a couple of other questions in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, one question. So you mentioned the native herbivores. What role can native herbivores provide in adapting the program to be inclusive of this alternative meat source?
I didn't hear the question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so about native herbivores, can the program be adaptive and include native herbivores as a meat source?
Certainly. I think that is we've targeted when I think about the cattle aspect of the program. We started with cattle, but we also enroll bison, for instance. So bison ranches, we're enrolling quite a few bison ranches, and you'll never hear me, again, it all comes down to management, but bison in most of these areas are the natural herbivore, the natural grazer, the natural complement to the ecosystem. There's no doubt about that. But we've seen a lot of positive results with cattle, and we are expanding the program to include other native herbivores as well. Okay, access. I have a question about access.
I was just, it wasn't so much about your talk, but I know this was being recorded, and if we wanted to go back and just rewatch certain points of the lecture, if that's something that is available to us.
Yeah, we need to post all of the recordings that we have in a place that's easy for everyone to find. So Frank and I will work on that. It's a great question, and we'll send that out to everybody in the wildlife circle.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you, Marshall.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a
Hey,
question.
while I'm unmuted, I have an obnoxious question, Marshall. Not that my first one wasn't. Okay, so one of the real challenges I've personally faced sometimes is I see the application of logic around how we can do bird-friendly grazing on private lands applied to how we should approach managing public lands. And that often deeply concerns me. One, because usually the public lands are all the stuff people didn't want because they're oftentimes drier and less resistant to grazing. They often also experience historic overgrazing in the regions I'm familiar with. So think arid Intermountain West. And then also we heavily subsidize, financially public lands grazing. Right, there's massive subsidies provided to it in a myriad of different ways, and so really it's the public paying for that to occur on public lands throughout the West. So, are there sort of limits to the way that you talk about this with private landowners, that we shouldn't use that same kind of logic when we start thinking about how to manage public lands?
Yeah, you did have an obnoxious question there, Dan. Well, two things. Number one, just so we don't overly focus on subsidies around public land and grazing, the public fit the bill for 45% of all agricultural revenue last year, right? So the public heavily subsidizes just about all forms of agriculture, and I won't get into the merits behind that, but it's a widespread situation across agriculture and across energy and across, you name it, right? So in terms of, I think the bottom line, there's a term realpolitik, and you work and as it sounds like you have, the notion of land being public or private in certain iterations, and a lot of iterations, in Colorado and areas like that, that's almost incidental, right? I have a saying, precedence rules the day. It's not always right, but there is a political consideration here, right? And a lot of public land has been privately managed land. And so I think there are just natural differences in the role of the public, the role of a group like Audubon in guiding, criticizing management on public land as opposed to private. So you're right, there should and there is a difference. There are if Rancher A decides on their own land to, fill in the blank, do whatever, Audubon has, and really no one has much say in that, right? Unless some NEPA laws or something like that in some way it is impacted. Whereas, a lot of these vegetation management plans are public, go through a public process. The public has a chance to add comments, et cetera, et cetera. And so to your core question, there are different ways we talk about management on public land, and there are certainly a plethora of options open to the public on public land that don't exist on private land. So that already happens. The way we think about management, we work with a lot of public land managers, BLM, Forest Service, and they really encourage their ranches to enroll in our program because our program, in terms of management, in terms of the ecological focus of the operation, is in many cases far more in depth than what is already required. So we take that quite a bit further through our program, and so it's typically encouraged from the Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, and others, because ultimately what I think they've seen, and I hope they see, is that the management between the landowner that's not enrolled in our program and the landowner that is going to be better when they're enrolled in our program. Now the bigger 50,000 foot level question, Dan, you know that's a hornet's nest, and you know I'm probably gonna stay clear of some of it. Because I don't personally work with a lot of public land. That is not my background. My background is working in the northern Great Plains, and that's 90% private land, and so that's my excuse for not swinging at all of that fastball.
And thank you again for a really thoughtful answer. I mean, I'm the opposite, right? Which is I've only thought about it from the public lands perspective, and I have just always respected, you know, that private landowners have the right to sort of choose how they manage their lands, and that people like you are doing amazing work trying to, you know, push better management through with private landowners. So I tend to think more about the public side. So, but anyway, thanks a lot for answering my question.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I've got a question too, Marshall. One that I think a lot of certification groups grapple with, and that is kind of a trade-off of how high to set the bar, right? To make the criteria really strict, which has its benefits for biodiversity, but might limit access to landowners and maybe marginalize it more on the market, versus lowering the bar and having, you know, a smaller impact, maybe reach a greater audience. And just wondering, when you guys were designing your program, were you grappling with that decision, and how did you settle on it?
Oh boy, quite a bit. Let me rephrase that. Have I frozen up, or can you see me still? Matt?
I see you frozen, but we can hear you.
You can hear me.
Yeah,
We can hear you, yeah, but you're just frozen.
But you look good frozen. So
you know, you never get frozen in it's always some grotesque kind of. So it's such a great question, and I'm gonna take it in two parts. Number one, not necessarily. What do I mean by that? Because I said yes.
Oops, now he's less than frozen.
Yeah.
Oh, darn. Oh, well.
Hopefully he knows and doesn't keep answering, which is probably what I would do. Just keep talking.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll certainly stick around here in case he's able to log back in, but I appreciate everybody hanging out. You're welcome to hang out longer if you'd like, but when's our next one, Frank? A couple weeks? Dan?
Yeah, we have a few weeks. I need to look at the schedule for it.
Yeah.
It's on April Fool's Day. It's next week, isn't it? April 1st.
Okay. Yep, next week.
Yeah, actually, Frank, I know Jen. I don't know if one of you guys in particular invited her, but if you want me to introduce her, I can.
Awesome. Sure.
Yeah, I went to grad school with her.
Cool. Oh yeah, that's right. She's also a Davis alum.
Oh, right. You're all from Davis. I forget.
I'm back.
You're back.
Okay.
Right.
Let me try this again. Hopefully my computer doesn't go on the fritz. Did you hear my first part or no?
I think we just barely got the beginning of it.
Okay. So the first part is no, it wasn't hard, right? The management is the easy part of the equation. What do I mean by that? I mean that when I think about management, the moving of cattle, the stocking rates, that part that creates the structural heterogeneity that birds or grassland birds are attracted to, respond to, that provides the brood rearing habitat for grassland birds, that part was easy, right? That part was easy. It was sort of intuitive. Where it became difficult was, should our program focused on birds care at all about animal welfare? Now the dilemma, right? Now we're into some moral gray area. We decided, yes, we decided that if we were really going to be holistic, regenerative, the care of the animals while a part of a livestock operation mattered. And so we included strong animal welfare protocols into the equation. Today, the link between neonicotinoid pesticides and the food chain, insect, invertebrate food chain, it's a no-brainer. Of course, it wasn't 7 years ago when we started the program. We included a strict no neonicotinoid use in our original protocols. That was a little bit more difficult, you could say, but we made that decision. We believe that Audubon saying something is bird friendly would probably get us by, but are we qualified? We're qualified to do bird habitat, to do policy work, advocacy, all of these good things. Are we qualified to certify a food product? We decided no, that yeah, we could probably get by with it, being Audubon saying it's bird friendly, and we have protocols and affidavits and all that good stuff. We decided to have a third party, a separate organization that does auditing, actually audit and verify that these practices were being followed. So Food Alliance does an audit on all of our ranches every year that they're enrolled in the program. It added a cost, roughly $140,000 a year just for the audits. So the program in total is somewhat a $2.5 million program, $2 million program to administer. So what is that? 5-10% of our overall budget is just on audits, and we don't charge, we don't cost share. Those were some difficult decisions, right? Because it wasn't directly affecting birds, but it was, I think, core to our audience, to our members. And so we decided to do that. So the answer to your question is yes and no. No, because managing for grassland birds is sort of just kind of straightforward. If you've got a pasture that looks like the ninth green, not a good thing, right? That's not good for anything. And if you have lush prairie, grasslands that you not only utilize, but you take into the winter, where you have cover and something growing that not only acts as sort of an armor all for the soil, which is a core tenet of regenerative grazing, but also provides the nesting cover in the spring before things start to grow. So those things were intuitive. Those things are well researched for the various species of grassland birds. The other things, do we care if animals receive antibiotics or hormones? Doesn't seem like it has a natural impact one way or the other on birds, but it is a part of our values, and we weren't blind to the fact that cattle have a stigma within the environmental community and within environmentally conscious consumers. and it's not hogwash, right? It's not total BS. And you wouldn't hear me say that. Cattle are different than bison. And oftentimes, and this was something we were always very open about with our ranch partners. Not something easy to be open about, but in this context, but we found the common ground, and the common ground was that pasture that looks like a golf course is not good for the rancher, right? It equates to more feed. It equates to more inputs, more costs for that rancher. So managing for grassland birds and avoiding feeding and the use of antibiotics, which is natural when you're feeding, that actually had a financial incentive for the landowner. So it was good for birds. It aligned with I've talked about that sort of Venn diagram approach. That finding that approach we've found has been good for the rancher, good for quality of life, good for the birds. Maybe not always directly good for the birds, but aligned with our values. So the answer is yes and no. It was hard in some cases. It was easy in others.
Great, thank you.
I had a question. You've been so generous with your time, so I was just wanting to make sure that you're still okay with continuing.
I am, absolutely. Go ahead.
Amazing.
Unless you're going to be obnoxious like Daniel. No, I'm kidding.
I'm not in Dan's lab, so don't worry. I had a question in relation to, you just touched on how much of ground can Audubon as a group stand on outside of birds? How slippery does that slope get? And so I was curious if you could talk a little bit in relation to how well does this certification cover other species beyond the taxa groups of grassland birds? How well can this be considered not just bird friendly, but maybe more ecosystem or wildlife friendly?
That's a great. I'm gonna wax a little bit poetically here about the canary in the coal mine and the notion of birds being an incredible umbrella species, a indicator of overall grassland health. And I think that's true, right? Because of what birds need in terms of food, in terms of different species of grasses and wildflowers that they eat during their life cycle for different nutritional value. The success of birds, are particularly grassland birds, are the real success of those birds is a great indicator, not just one species, but the suite of species, knowing that you have that vibrant suite of species that need a little bit of different aspect of the ecosystem. When we don't just monitor bird abundance, but the bird friendliness index has abundance, diversity, and resilience, right? So the diversity of birds and the abundance are both really important. And I would say, there are a number of studies that show when you manage for grassland birds and what grassland birds need, you're saving more cover on the landscape. That's allowing more carbon sequestration to take place. More in a healthier and more diverse pastures equate to more healthy soils. That means that more water is being stored in those grassland soils. Grassland soil. The soil is able to sequester, purify, and discharge that water into streams, rivers, and tributaries and aquifers that are recharged under grasslands. And so we feel, and there are a number of studies out there that show that grassland birds are a great indicator of those other ecosystem services, that other wildlife. Interestingly enough, and I hate that I'm going to say this, but I'm just going to be honest and say it, grassland birds are a good indicator of pollinator health, but not solely a great indicator of pollinator health. Why? Because birds respond to the structural heterogeneity of the grasslands a little bit more than the actual diversity of plants. That makes sense? And so pollinators, on the other hand, monarchs, right? Milkweed, right? If you do not have milkweed, you're not going to produce. You may have monarchs butterflies move through, but you're not going to produce monarch butterflies. They are tied inextricably to milkweed. And so when you look at the broader set of pollinators and you drill down on what they need, what specific wildflowers and forbs they're dependent on, that gets a little bit more tricky in saying definitively that what's great for grassland birds is great for pollinators, and quite honestly, vice versa. So there are a number of studies, and we feel confident that when you take care and you promote good grassland bird habitat, you catch a lot of those, Brian. I would suspect you don't catch all of those. Anyone else have a question? This has been really great for me, and hope you guys have enjoyed it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and thank you for your generosity, taking the time to continue to answer questions. All right. I don't see any more questions. I think we shall adjourn. Thank you so much, Marshall. Thanks everybody for attending. I think we all learned a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marshall.
Yep.
Thanks.
Yep. Take care.
All right.